I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, Anna Gilmore, Professor of Public Health in our Department for Health. Anna's research is concerned with the impact of policy interventions on health and health behaviours, evidence-based approaches to public health and corporate influences on health and policy. Like Paul, Anna has strong policy links. She's a council member of Action on Smoking and Health, England, and she's a distinguished expert with the National Heart Forum. She's also a member of the Royal College of Physicians Tobacco Advisory Group. Anna's title today, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, the Corporate Subversion of Public Health.
Okay, I'm going to just share with you today one aspect of our research, that of tobacco industry influence on public health policy. And I'm going to do another whistle-stop tour. I'm going to try and use three, or really it's kind of 2.25 case studies, because the last one is very much work in progress, and give you a couple of examples of how our research has influenced policy. So first, some background. Tobacco is the only consumer product that kills when used exactly as the manufacturer intends, and does so at a massive rate, leading to the deaths of 1 in 2 of the long-term users. There is also no other legal product that I know of which is as addictive as tobacco. Not only does evidence suggest that it's as addictive as hard drugs such as heroin, but also that the tobacco industry has deliberately manipulated the cigarette to harness that addictiveness. The scale of deaths from tobacco is quite profound. In the last century, it's estimated that it caused 100 million deaths. In this century, estimates are that if trend continues, 1 billion will die from tobacco. So I also want to introduce, by way of background, the tobacco industry. There are now 4 major tobacco companies: Philip Morris International, strictly speaking, British American Tobacco, Japan Tobacco International, and Imperial Tobacco. Now 2 of those, BAT and Imperial Tobacco, are based here in the UK. Now, in the late 1990s, these companies were forced to release their internal documents to the public as a result of litigation in the US. And it's these documents that we've used for much of our research. And I've put just a couple of examples of these documents up here. And I hope these illustrate the ways in which these documents allow you to gain insights into corporate conduct that otherwise really would be very difficult to obtain. I just want to draw your attention to this lower one here about the importance of younger adult smokers have been the critical factor in the growth and decline of every major brand and company over the last 50 years. And it explains why. Because the renewal of the market stems almost entirely from 18-year-olds. They have to renew the market because their current customers die. They need to recruit new ones, and they recruit children. Currently, this is an old document, currently 40% of children in this country start before the age of 16. So the first case study, I should also say that very stupidly, I managed to burn my mouth yesterday on some really hot food, so it's slightly difficult to talk, so bear with me. So the first case study, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and a process of mass privatization of state assets began as part of the profound changes in the region. And this included the privatization of the previously state-owned tobacco companies. And as a result, these major tobacco companies rushed into the market. We capitalized on that unique social experiment to examine the impact of those changes. And let me just very briefly, we published about 20-odd papers on this, so I'm just going to give you a brief oversight. So cigarette consumption increased massively after the transnational tobacco companies went in there. Moreover, the increase was really confined to the countries in which these companies had invested. So if we look at the countries where they'd invested in the early 1990s, we see a 56% increase, but no change at all in the countries where they'd not invested. If you look at female smoking rates, this is the data from Russia, we see a doubling from 7 to 15% in female smoking rates, and a reduction in the age of uptake. And that's important because the younger you start, the worse the health impacts. We also found that male smoking rates, which were already incredibly high, increased significantly. So the impacts were really quite profound. How do we explain this? Well, the most obvious way is this: the massive increase in tobacco marketing, which had previously been unknown in the region. When I looked through marketing spend data, the tobacco companies were the biggest spenders in almost every medium in all the countries where there were data. Moreover, we could link their marketing documents to smoking patterns that we observed in our surveys. But that's really just one element of the explanation. In fact, behind the scenes, the documents give us a far broader understanding of what was really happening. So there are two things I want to highlight. So first is that the tobacco companies were involved in the large-scale smuggling of their own products. This may seem counterintuitive, but the tobacco companies make their money when they sell to the distributor. It doesn't matter if that distributor is in the legal or the illegal channel. They will still make their profits. I don't have time to go into the reasons I've listed here for why there are a number of advantages that smuggling brings, but key is that smuggled cigarettes are cheaper than legal cigarettes because there's no taxes on them. They're cheaper, and therefore you sell more because price is obviously one of the biggest barriers to tobacco use. I should also say that this isn't an isolated example. There is overwhelming evidence from the tobacco industry's own documents that it's been extensively involved in cigarette smuggling on a global scale, and that this has been a core part of its business strategy. I've looked at lots of countries in the industry documents, and in every country I've looked at, I've seen the tobacco companies smuggling. And of course, the other thing we saw was real influence over public health policy, all sorts of policies in all sorts of settings. And I'm just going to share with you one example. So this is Uzbekistan, 1994. BAT was about to buy out not just one factory, but the whole of the Uzbek tobacco industry, when it suddenly discovered, as it was about to finalize its deal, that the Minister of Health had actually passed a very effective piece of tobacco control legislation. I've just summarized some of it here on the left. It included a comprehensive ban on tobacco advertising and a ban on smoking in public places. Now, BAT's response was both swift and massive. Within 24 hours, it had produced an amended decree. And really what it was doing here was replacing the ban with a voluntary code. And they managed to pull off the shelf a voluntary code they'd already put in place in Russia and that they would go on to use elsewhere. Now, the health minister actually stood his ground. So BAT appealed to their friend, President Karimov, who'd been helping them effectively in this deal. Now, President Karimov, as some of you will remember, he's been in power now for 22 years. He's known for his human rights abuses and systematic use of torture. This is the guy that boils his enemies in vats of oil. I don't know if people remember that. So, of course, as soon as they appealed to Karimov, the decree was overturned. Indeed, the order requiring the ministry to overturn the decree and amend it was faxed from BAT's Tashkent office. But publicly, this is the spin that BAT put on this. You can read this. The key thing is, they're saying here at the bottom, as I've highlighted, that BAT's role in formulating this voluntary code, no mention, of course, of the ban that had preceded it, was seen as a reflection of the company's responsible attitude. So let me tell you a little bit more about this responsible attitude. There were two main arguments that BAT used against this advertising ban. The first was, and I'm quoting here, smoking has not been proven to actually cause diseases. Now, this is 1994. It was 50 years after the first case control studies linked smoking to lung cancer. It was 40 years after the major cohort studies came out, and it was 30 years after the scientific consensus had really very clearly established that smoking was linked to diseases. The second argument that they used was that advertising does not affect consumption. Yet simultaneously, their marketing documents planned for a 45% increase in consumption. And of course, not only was there a 45% increase, in fact, it was slightly bigger than that. Okay, so moving swiftly on, the European Union. Now, my heart always sinks when I try and explain this piece of research, because actually it's really complex, but I will do my best. So better regulation is really what it says on the tin. It's a system of improving regulation. It aims really to simplify regulation and reduce the administrative burden, particularly on business. And it does so using risk assessment to say, is the risk of this substance large enough that we need to do something about it? And impact assessment to say, what will be the impact of this policy? And then consultation with affected stakeholders. So it seems like a great idea. And better regulation is now central to policy making, not only in Europe, but in many other places around the world, including here in the UK. So all major policies in the EU now have to go through an impact assessment process. Now, we were doing some work actually trying to look at the industry's influence on tobacco control policy in Europe when we found that British American Tobacco, working with a whole group of other corporations, had significantly influenced this better regulation agenda. So starting in 1995, they worked with a whole group of other corporate actors to promote impact assessment, and specifically to promote business impact assessment, which of course emphasizes the impact on businesses, and in which the costs and benefits of a particular policy have to be assessed in monetary terms. Now, they did this specifically because they believed it would make it harder to pass public health policies. And the documents outline the range of ways in which they thought such a system could work to their advantage. So it includes securing early corporate involvement in discussions, providing an economic framework for assessing the impacts of policies that would implicitly prioritize the costs and the impacts on businesses. And if you think about this, it makes sense, because to assess the costs on a business is actually quite straightforward. What do? You ask the business, and they can give you the data in monetary terms. But actually to assess the impacts of a public health policy or an environmental policy on health or the environment, kind of diffuse impacts that happen in the longer term is far harder. Of course, if you want to know about the business impacts, you ask the business, and that then builds in a requirement, a dependency, if you like, on that corporation's data and the information supplied by those corporations. And then they also felt that it would provide a means of challenging legislation. And above all, what BAT was actually trying to drive at was trying to get risk assessment on the agenda. There wasn't a window of opportunity to promote risk assessment, so it was doing it through this impact assessment window, if you like. And here what they were really trying to do is move away from the use of the precautionary principle in policy making. Now, what's interesting is these exact same arguments as BAT provides for its rationale are concerns that the literature now over time has raised about business impact assessment, particularly using this cost-benefit analysis approach. So here, I don't expect you to read all of this. This is the kind of simplistic diagrammatic representation of the campaign. And I just want to highlight two things. So one is the corporations that were involved. So above all, these were really corporations whose products were potentially damaging to health or the environment. So there were chemical companies such as Bayer or Dow, petrochemical companies like Shell, and food companies such as Coca-Cola. The other thing is, if you follow the lines and arrows, there was very little direct corporate lobbying. Instead, almost all of the lobbying initially, in these early stages certainly, was done through the European Policy Centre, which is one of Brussels' largest and most eminent think tanks. And this is because BAT had been advised that if it wanted to achieve regulatory reform, it wouldn't be good coming from a tobacco industry, and it therefore needed to hide its presence behind a third party. And the use of this third party was really central to BAT's success. This is an interview we did with David Byrne, who was the health commissioner in Brussels for 5 years. I've seen the documents, the industry's documents on Byrne, and I can tell you that he's, of all the people I've seen documents on, he is probably the most clued up about and adept at dealing with the tobacco industry. And yet even he was shocked that the European Policy Centre might have been advocating on the tobacco industry's behalf. As I've alluded to, the campaign was successful. So within 2 years, BAT and its allies had secured changes to the European Treaty via the Treaty of Amsterdam that made business impact assessment and stakeholder consultation mandatory. Now, this was 1997. They then went on to secure the implementation of those changes in practice. And I don't have time to go into that, but for example, they played a key role in influencing what became mandatory standards on business consultation. Or sorry, minimum standards on consultation that they're called. Yeah. And of course, this finding raises concerns that the European Union's impact assessment system may not act in the public interest and could rather act in the interest of corporations. And there is, because it took a while for these treaty changes to be implemented, there is some evidence that the chemical companies have used it to their advantage. There's now a tobacco control policy going through in Europe that looks like impact assessment has been used to hold up the process. But it's, you know, we haven't really, we're just starting our research on that. So just to digress slightly, to look at how our research influenced policy. So I've shown you that one of the changes that VAT secured was to make stakeholder consultation compulsory. Now, simultaneously with VAT's efforts to influence policy in Europe, the World Health Organization was developing its first ever global health treaty, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And as part of that treaty, perhaps its most novel element is Article 5.3, which does what it says here. The idea is that parties to the treaty, of which there now are some 170, shall act to protect their policies from the commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry. Now, all this research on the tobacco industry had already contributed to the recognition of the need for Article 5.3. But we then realized, as we were finalizing our research, that the tobacco industry was lobbying EU member states, claiming that there was a big problem with 5.3 because it contravened the concept of better regulation and was inconsistent with the minimum standards of consultation. So we were able then to produce a briefing for member states explaining the role that the tobacco industry had played in promoting those concepts, which of course they hadn't revealed to them in their lobbying. And that in turn helped secure member state support for strong guidelines on Article 5.3, which were being developed at that time. So the third case study. As some of you will know, the government has been held a consultation last year on the possibility of implementing standardised cigarette packaging like this. That was held last year, and there was an expectation that this would be included in the Queen's speech last week, but it wasn't. So I felt it was incumbent upon me to say something about standardised packaging, seeing as the meeting was now. So standardised packaging, like minimum unit pricing of alcohol and a statutory register of lobbyists, was omitted from the Queen's speech. But before I go into the detail, let me just give you a little bit of background which kind of draws together some of the issues I've talked about already. So we have a product which is both deadly and addictive. We have a tobacco industry whose misconduct has now been heavily exposed and its reputation damaged. There's far more research than what we've done on that. We also now have a Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and it includes Article 5.3, which at least in theory should reduce the tobacco industry's ability to influence policy. Plus, in the UK, tobacco control has really been a public health success story over recent decades. So we now have in place all the standard tobacco control policies. And in fact, the UK has been assessed as having the most effective policies in Europe. Yet still, a fifth of the population smoke. As I've told you, 40% of those take it up before they're 16. There are marked inequalities in smoking, and it remains our leading cause of death and disease. So it would seem that sensible to do something more about smoking, but we clearly need to innovate. So this is where the idea for standardised packaging comes in. I say standardised rather than plain, because as you can see, that they're not plain, unlike this advert that the tobacco industry would have us believe. I don't have time to go into the evidence on standardised packaging, but they say a picture says a million words, and I think you can see that this pack gives a far clearer message about the health impacts of smoking and is far less attractive to smokers, particularly young people taking it up, than these packs which we currently have on the market. Now, the background I've just presented to you would suggest that not only is there a clear case for doing something further on tobacco, but that doing so now should be more straightforward than in the past. Yet clearly it wasn't in the Queen's speech. So I'm therefore going to try and illustrate to you now the ongoing difficulties of making tobacco control policy here, using just one of the many arguments the tobacco industry uses against policy. This is in fact one of its favourite arguments. We've done 2 systematic reviews recently on the way the tobacco industry influences first tax policy and then marketing policy, and one of its favourite arguments is policy X will lead to an increase in illicit tobacco. The arguments they're making here: illicit tobacco is a problem, illicit tobacco is increasing, and standardised packaging will make that worse. Now, for those of you who don't read The Sun, fag packet ban boosts terror means standardised packaging will lead to an increase in illicit tobacco trade. Now, the beauty of this argument is that, of course, it's plausible. If the packs were plain, as industry would have us believe, it would make sense that they would be easy to counterfeit. Okay? The reality is they're not plain. Counterfeiting is already incredibly easy and happens. And in fact, it's counted through the use of invisible pack markings and numerical coding on packs, which will still be there. So the experts tell us that really it's very unlikely that standardized packaging will increase counterfeiting in the illicit tobacco trade. Yet, in the industry's submissions, this is a clear argument against the policy. There are now, a variety of industry reports and also a whole lot of press reports making this claim. We looked at press reports containing industry data on illicit from 2008 onwards. And the interesting thing is, there were none here, even though the rate of illicit tobacco use in the country was far higher then. They suddenly appear as soon as the government makes a commitment to examine standardized packaging and continue during its consultation on standardized packaging. So they make a couple of claims. I'm going to try and run through this quickly. Illicit is high and increasing. And when we go through all these articles, what do we see? Well, they're nearly all based on industry surveys. What it does is what we call empty pack surveys. So it goes and picks up cigarette litter and then determines whether those cigarette packs that it's picked up are legal or illegal. One of the difficulties is in all of these articles, and this is illustrated in this one, is that they're conflating two issues. So there's something called non-UK duty paid. Those are cigarettes which haven't had UK tobacco duties paid on. Illicit is just a subset of that. It is the majority of that, but non-UK duty paid also includes duty-free sales and cigarettes that have been purchased abroad on which foreign taxes have been paid. And when we read through these articles, you can see that they're conflating those two issues. So when we try and make sense of the data, it's virtually impossible. And those data and the surveys that they come from are not made publicly available in any format that we've been able to find. And therefore we have no details of their methodology. But when we do look at the data that's publicly available, this is what we see. Illicit rates are coming down. So I've used non-UK duty paid because for industry data, there's only I can get Philip Morris data actually on illicit. I just want to highlight two things, or a few things really. The green line is HMRC, Her Majesty Revenue and Customs data. So this is government data. The rest are industry data. This is the UK Tobacco Manufacturers Association data, again, apparently from empty pack surveys. The reason we're told that these find higher rates than everything else is they decide to do these surveys in sports stadia, and I'm reliably informed that that's at football stadia. I think if you had to choose somewhere where you'd find high rates of illicit, it would probably be there. And the other thing is this. So this is a report produced by Japan Tobacco International, another one of the tobacco companies, last year, trying to make claims about the problem of illicit tobacco. Now, what they're claiming is that's HMRC data, but I've put the HMRC data there. The reason is HMRC gives a most likely estimate and then a range. And throughout its reporting, JTI always picks the top end of the range. And then what happened was suddenly then, literally 3 weeks ago, just as the government was, it turns out, finalising its decision on plain packaging, we have a new report from Philip Morris claiming there's been this sudden increase. Well, it seemed odd. It went against the existing trend. If you dug right to the back of that report in tiny footnotes, you would discover, in fact, they changed the methodology and the way they collect the data, and therefore the 2012 data can't be compared with the 2011 data. So we're left with one non-industry report, but this is just regional data. So this is for the northeast of England. That's their estimate of illicit, and by contrast, this is Japan Tobacco's estimate of non-UK duty paid. So there's a lot of data. There's a lot of press coverage, much of it of poor quality. At least some of the industry reporting appears to be deliberately misleading. There's very little transparency over the industry data or their methodology. But we can see from the sports stadia example that the methodology could bias the outcomes. And therefore, it's difficult to make sense of the data. And yet, this is just really a microcosm of all the evidence that the industry is pushing out there on plain packaging. We've been going through systematically their submissions to the policy consultation. And this comprises some of it. But the evidence they're trying to submit on plain packaging is far greater. And it makes you realise how difficult it is actually for civil servants and ministers to make sense of this. This is then further compounded by this problem, the so-called experts on illicit. So we've seen the appearance of a couple of very senior ex-policemen. They've been cited as experts in the tobacco industry submissions. They've been cited in the media, including writing their own columns, and they've submitted evidence to the House of Lords inquiry. But it turns out that both are founding members of, and Sheridan is the director of, something called the Common Sense Alliance, which in turn is funded by BAT. So it appears they're not entirely independent. We also know from documents that were leaked from Philip Morris, both in Australia, where they have now implemented standardised packaging, and here in the UK, that using third parties is a key part of the tobacco industry's public relations efforts over standardised packaging. So, this is my last slide. In summary, tobacco control policymaking is complicated by the presence of a very powerful and well-resourced industry whose interests are antithetical to public health, and really they have to oppose every effective public health policy because it's their requirement to maximise returns to shareholders. So whilst on the one hand we have made progress in tobacco control and in securing Article 5.3, I've also shown you that really there's a danger that their ability to influence policy has been systematised through innovations in governance, such as better regulation and impact assessment. And also that they remain able to influence policy in large part due to their resource advantage. So that if they've lost their credibility and as a result of 5.3, it's harder to directly access politicians, they can use the media to get their message. They can commission surveys to drown everyone in data, and they can pay third parties to make their case more palatable. But we also face a linked problem, and this is where this comes in. And that is that the policy cycle, slow as it may seem, is faster generally than the research cycle. And in light of this, we have set up this wiki, tobaccotactics.org, really as a novel form of knowledge exchange. And what we're doing on that is making our preliminary research findings public. And the reason we're doing this is it then will enable those findings, we hope, to have a greater impact on policy. So if you take, for example, the example of the Common Sense Alliance, we're trying to go systematically through the industry's evidence, looking at the quality of the evidence and who is providing that evidence. And when looking at who is providing those evidence, obviously we'll be looking into various people. But when we get to write our academic papers, we won't have the space to write the detail on the Common Sense Alliance and RAM and Sheridan. But we can provide that information here on this wiki. So that's the idea behind it. And also we can, and we're starting to summarise our existing research, which then also makes it publicly available. The interesting thing is that we come in for quite a lot of abuse working in this area. And what's been quite interesting is I would say that over the years it's this that has caused us more grief and abuse than anything else, which is quite interesting because it focuses on the tobacco industry. So that's all I'm going to say. I just want to acknowledge all the co-authors, some of whom are in the audience, and everyone in the Tobacco Control Research Group, and our funders, without whom this research would not have been possible, and some of them are also in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. A number of really important issues raised there. I think I'd like to invite Fiona Andrews, who's Director of Smoke 3 South West, to say a few words. I don't know where she is. Oh, there she is. She's sitting there. Smoke Free South West works with local authorities in seeking to reduce smoking in the area. So, Fiona.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to add a few questions and thoughts of my own following just a fascinating debate. Just to say up front, we benefit enormously from the expertise that Anna brings. Anna's on the board of Smoke Free South West, which is a body funded by directors of public health within the local authorities across the South West region to do a range of things, including attempting to tackle illegal supply. But moving back to Anna, I mean, the reputation of the work that's produced here around the evidence, building the evidence around what on earth we do to tackle this massive epidemic, It plays out on a global scale. So I think one of the challenges for the Institute, or I guess one of the first questions, is how is this Institute going to not only play out on a national platform, but where are the opportunities to build on doing this globally? And I think Anna's presentation made a very strong case for why it has to be done that way. If we've got 4 global giants and a massive tobacco industry in China building up out there too, there are things that you can do in Bath for your population, but there are also things that need to be on that EU stage and that global stage, because we do have here a David and Goliath situation. And that brings me back to one thing I'd like to touch on that I think is there in Anna's presentation, is I think a lot of the policy narrative, for obvious reasons, is around individual responsibility. So what is the individual responsibility of a smoker to decide to stop, to take up the fantastic services, stop smoking services, which are free at the point of delivery, and puts the question in their court. And I do think what we've heard today provides part of both the question and the answer to that is we are so outplayed by incredibly well-resourced, incredibly swift, incredibly skilled industries who are doing what they are supposed to do, and that's make a profit for their shareholders. But just how do we, in terms of policy and in terms of public health, then work to do the things we need to do to protect our kids, our families, from the absolute misery of discovering that it's you that's got the short straw and has got that emphysema and spends your life breathing through a straw or feeling like you are. It does come back to the personal as well as the political and the policy stage. A couple of other things. I think Anna referred to the fact that this isn't just any other product. It's a product particularly engineered for its addictiveness. And Anna referred to the evidence of that. It's uniquely deadly. It's not like other products. So again, there's this question, are we brave enough? Can we really look in a policy level at not just doing what we've always done, that narrative about building on experience, and do the more ambitious thing? So I guess that's one question. How brave and ambitious and courageous are we willing to be with our policies? And as Anna said, we've got a pariah industry. We've got a deadly consumer product that kills 1 in 2 of its long-term customers. And we've got something that is being marketed very actively to our kids, to children. And again, that point about 8 out of 10 starting as teenagers before they're 18, is that free choice? Do we make free choices at that age when we're so wrapped up in logos and aspiring to be an adult? And this product, as I think is on record, is they don't sell tobacco, they sell adulthood and rebellion, I think is on record again in some of those papers. So finally, there's something about scale. There's something about policy scale, the scale of this tsunami that's coming towards us. There's something about the fact that we've got 2 of the companies of these big 4 with home authorities based in one not far down the road in the UK, and the fact that the damage, this global damage, this inedible, indigestible 1 billion, what is the UK role and what is Bath's role in informing brave policies that really do stop this epidemic before it steals people's lives and takes away those opportunities, the opportunities lost to do other things and be well and contribute to the economy and walk your dog. So I think there's all those questions, and it's about scale, it's about delay, it's about opportunity cost, and it's about stamina. And I think my last point is we've talked about influencing policy, but clearly this needs a long-term sustained response. It's so global. And I guess my question is, how does that work with the election timescale? How do we keep this on the radar longer?
Thank you very much, and you've raised a number of really interesting points. But I think before I ask Anna to come back, I'll have a chance to take some questions and other comments from people around the room. Yes, please, over here. Anyone else want to wave at me while we're... Yes, I'll collect a few up. Yes, I'm going to collect, Anna. So I've got 3 already. So.
Thank you very much for a pretty scary presentation. My name's Tim Mays. I'm a chemical engineer here at Bath. I'm also director of the university's Institute for Sustainable Energy and the Environment, and I'd like to pose a question to you related to another substance that's addictive and deadly, that has a framework convention, and that has a global aspect to it, and that's carbon dioxide. And I wondered whether there are some analogies to be drawn between managing the consumption of tobacco and managing the consumption of energy, leading to the emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. And I think it was in the middle here, yes? Where did I see someone? Oh, here, yeah. Oh, well, I found you now.
Thank you. I'm Alison Cox from Cancer Research UK, and also Cancer Research UK and our other partners in the Smoke Free Alliance benefit greatly from the research done here at Bath and by Anna. You describe a sort of ongoing battle with the industry that no matter what evidence you're able to produce about their tactics, their deceit, their involvement in smuggling, what have you, they still seem to keep outfoxing us on policy. So, you know, for example, at the moment we know the illicit argument had a lot of traction in the standard packaging debate. Do you feel, no matter what you find, is there ever a silver bullet that's going to actually discredit the industry sufficiently? You know, what, if anything, through your research could you do that might make the critical blow?
And did I have another one? Yes, please, it's here. Yeah. It's just the mic.
Genevieve Knight from the Policy Studies Institute. This isn't my area, but I think the idea of analogies is important in policy making. And when I think about this issue and public health costs of it, the historical ones that come to mind are asbestosis and slightly more tangentially, slave trade, where Britain actually made a very strong link to the end of those industry-based and highly vested interest issues, but which had health or other ethical consequences. And I think in the terms of policy debate, courage is something you're going to need to find, and a strong sponsor, because if you look to those case studies, that was the only way that ethics could be drawn upon and that a global industry could be forced down.
Good, thank you very much. There, you've got some challenging political and ethical questions, Anna. Over to you.
Okay. So global warming, I mean, I would say we're dealing with the same issues. And I think one of the, I always think we work in these silos. You know, so we have our little tobacco control silo, then there's the silo on alcohol policy, and there's a silo on food policy, and a silo on global warming. But actually, the issues are the same, because in all of those areas, there is a powerful industry trying to oppose policy. And when you look at the evidence, actually, these corporations behave in the same way. And I think one of the key things is their manipulation of the science. There's overwhelming evidence of the way that has happened in all of those areas. You know, the way they use think tanks, you know, the tactics are the same. And I think we do need to link up those silos. And I think that's one of the potential benefits of having this institute. I think the difficulty is that we all have so much to do. You know, I feel overwhelmed just within my little tobacco control silo. Then the difficulty of branching out, you know, there's a problem there. And I think if we think about moving forward, that in some ways the short-term wins may, I think, be easier achieved within the silos, but actually the bigger and long-term wins will be achieved by branching outwards. And I think it's not just a matter of linking those silos, and I think this addresses your question a bit as well, but it's also about looking upstream. So we need to look at the kind of the policy infrastructure. So, you know, that we need to increase transparency. We need a statutory register of lobbyists. We need rules on revolving doors. I think we need to look at the role of the media. When I listen to the debates, it's the same on global warming. You know, there always has to be an opponent. But why? You know, if the evidence is so strongly in one direction, does that really need to be debated? That kind of, the way the media works gives this, I think, artificial prominence to the people that are continually doubting the evidence. I think we need to look at the better regulation system and the impact assessment system and the way that evidence is dealt with within that, and the way that when industry submits evidence, it's just able to buy evidence and submit that in, and how are civil servants supposed to make sense of that. So I think there are infrastructural things we can do upstream. And then even further upstream, and you know, this gets out of my comfort zone, we need to look at 21st century capitalism as you know, how is that working, and corporate governance in general. So I think there's lots of issues, and it requires us to be brave, and it requires us to move out of our comfort silos into those other areas. And then, Alison, you had a question on, you know, is there a silver bullet? I mean, I think we used to think maybe there was a silver bullet, but I don't think there is. I mean, if we look at illicit tobacco, you know, the evidence that the industry was smuggling its own cigarettes on a global basis is overwhelming. You know, in this country, you know, we've got Alison Cox, the CEO of Imperial Tobacco, arguing in The Sun that it's going to boost terror. Just 10 years ago, the Public Accounts Committee said to her predecessor, "You're either crooks or you're stupid, and you don't look very stupid to me. How could you possibly have sold, you know, exported cigarettes to Andorra, Moldova, Afghanistan, Kaliningrad, without the knowledge that they would then be smuggled back into the UK?" You know, it was taking its Regal brand, its Super Kings brand. Those brands are not smoked in Andorra, you know, in the knowledge that they would be smuggled back in, and on a massive scale. And yet here they are still able to make these arguments, even when they're incredibly misleading. So I think if that, you know, the scale of the misconduct on illicit, if that wasn't a silver bullet, I don't think we have one. And I think one of the difficulties is that the industry is framed the way, and it really kind of has framed the way in which we debate these things, both in the media and within the policy process. And it's very clear it doesn't want the precautionary principle. It wants science and evidence. But you know, that's an absolute farce when we've got the evidence that the way in which they have totally you know, undermined science. And if you look in their submissions now at the way they've used science, it really is incredibly misleading. But I think the trouble is that we're being drawn into debating it on their terms, and we need to start thinking outside the box. And I think this is an issue more in a way for you guys, but how do we debate this, and how do we change the terms of engagement? And I hope that kind of speaks to what you said as well. And I think this, yeah, we do need courage. I mean, I can say more on ideas, but maybe we should... Yeah, I think we probably, sad to say, ran out of time on that. So please could you join with me again in thanking Anna for her very stimulating presentation. Thank you.